Is faith a matter of all or nothing? Do we say about faith, close only counts in horseshoes and hand grenades? Or as Ricky Bobby's dad famously said, if you're not first, you're last. Is that what faith is? Is there room for hesitancy, fear, or doubt? Here's where this comes in. Like a child jumping into a pool to daddy's arms. Willing to do it, but still a little bit reluctant. And these are actually videos. I want to show you this because I remembered this video, and then I found two of them. The one on the left is June 2018, when Claire was 3, and the one on the right is October. But notice the difference. Where's my cursor? There you go. The volume is on the right one, but just jumps right in. The life vest is sitting right there. No hesitancy, no worry, no fear. Gotta turn the volume down on that one so you can hear the other one. No, it won't let me, oh, never mind. I'll just overplay it. And then here comes October, that same year. All right, we're walking around. We're going to jump in, right? I'm okay, she says. Look at that. Did you hear it? Come closer to me. Ugh, and then finally does it once. Meanwhile, this kid from June, I got no worries. I can do this. No fear, no hesitancy. October, I'm not so sure about this. Come closer. Do you remember that? No? Pause them both. Does faith have to be calm, cool, and collected? Your part's done. You can go to junior church now. We know that without faith it is impossible to please God, but how much faith is that talking about? What is the quality of the faith that we need? What is the quantity? How do we figure that out? Can you lose what you have? If you lose it, can you regain it? Can it grow? Can it become stronger? These are all important questions, and the answers are not going to fit on a bumper sticker or a t-shirt. They're more complicated than that. We've got two different examples from our text this morning in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 9, that illustrate a little bit of what I'm trying to talk about here by showing you, of course, that's my daughter, and so, that's why I end up showing you that, but I think that does illustrate the point that I'm trying to make. So let's look at chapter 9, verse 14, picking back up where we left off. Last week, we saw the transfiguration, right? That was our 2 weeks ago, our Palm Sunday message was about the transfiguration and the glory on the mountain. Here's where it picks up, verse 14. When they came down to the other disciples, they saw a large crowd around them and the teachers of the law arguing with them. So here we are at the foot of the mountain. We have just experienced the high point of the transfiguration. Jesus with Peter, James, and John, with Moses and Elijah being there. And now we're coming back to regular, normal. Some people call that real life after that mountaintop experience. Only to discover that we've got 9 disciples that we left behind, and they're in the middle of a heated argument with some of the religious leaders of Judaism, known here as the teachers of the law, and there's a crowd looking on. In other words, this is a crisis. This is a problem. Any of you ever come back to work, first day back from vacation, to something like this? Maybe they were saving it for when you got back, just to share it with you, or it just blows up on the first day. That's disheartening. You were relaxed, you were calm, you were refreshed, and you come back to the office or the factory or the store or wherever it is, and boom, there it is. You got to deal with it. And that's Jesus, coming down the mountain only to find this. As soon as all the people saw Jesus, they were overwhelmed with wonder and ran to greet him. Mark doesn't explain for us what's prompting their reaction, what they're thinking. But it seems likely that the arrival of Jesus is like dad coming home to a house full of squabbling children. When you only have one, you don't have this fear, you see. When I was a kid, this may have happened a few times. They look to him to set things right, to put an end to the fight. It isn't as if Jesus can't fill that role, but it's not an encouraging sign that they need him to do it. His disciples should have been more than capable of this by now. The teachers of the law should have been on the same side. They shouldn't have been fighting. They should have been trying to work together. But instead, they're the opposition. So Jesus asks the question, what are you arguing with them about? That's the classic parent question, right? How many times, if you had more than one kid, did you have to ask this, what are you fighting about? I won't ask my mom how many times she had to ask, what are you fighting about? Normally it was me and my sister. My brother and I got along swimmingly, but we may have prompted that question a few times over the years. How often is the answer to that question something you actually need to know? How often does that fix anything, knowing what they're fighting about? Typically, this fight could have been avoided, and it's probably not worth arguing about anyway. At least in this case, Jesus is about to learn that the controversy, the thing that they're arguing about, is a real thing. It's not a dumb thing, it's a real thing. Whether or not it could have been avoided, we will have to keep reading our text to find out. So what are they arguing about? Well, a man in the crowd answered, "Teacher, I brought you my son, who is possessed by a spirit that has robbed him of speech. Whenever it seizes him, it throws him to the ground. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. I asked your disciples to drive out the spirit, but they could not." Now, if we think back, Mark has already documented that Jesus gave his disciples the authority to drive out demons. If you remember way back in chapter 3, verse 15, he gave them that authority. And they've already done so successfully on their own when he sent them out in pairs to the villages and they drove out many demons. Chapter 6, verse 13. So something is amiss because they should be able to handle this situation. He gave them the authority. They've done it before. What's the problem? The description of the boy's symptoms resembles very much so epilepsy, a disease that was considered to be a sign of divine displeasure in the ancient world. They thought that was a sign that the gods or whatever had cursed you. Famously, Julius Caesar, we believe, has had epilepsy. He was an epileptic. He was able to hide that from the common people, but there's enough evidence that he had that because he wouldn't have wanted the common people to know, because then they wouldn't have wanted him as one of their leaders. Well, whether this particular demon is mimicking epilepsy or causing epilepsy is really a secondary question, because the real question is, why have the disciples failed to cast it out, to overcome it? What's the problem? Interestingly, Mark doesn't focus on that question right away. That's not where we start. What happened with the disciples? Jesus is going to turn his attention to this boy's father, and the disciples will have to wait till the end of our text. But first he says this, "You unbelieving generation," Jesus replied, "how long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy to me." It's not fully clear what's making Jesus frustrated here. The first thought is that his disciples can't handle this on their own. Maybe that's an annoyance. Or perhaps it's that the teachers of the law are here making things worse instead of helping. That's annoying. Or maybe it's the crowd that's simply gawking and come here to see a show. Maybe it's some of all of that is just getting on his nerves when he says this. But he asks an important question. How long am I going to be here? Well, the building up of faith is no small task. After about 3 years of effort, Jesus, his work is not yet done with these 12 men. Then again, it never really is it? the journey of faith continues. To steal a line from The Hobbit, the road goes ever on and on. Jesus decides in this moment he will solve the problem himself. Now is not the time to walk the disciples through how to do it. He's going to solve it himself. Verse 20, so they brought him. When the spirit saw Jesus, it immediately threw the boy into a convulsion. He fell to the ground and rolled around, foaming at the mouth. This is a dramatic moment, is it not? No wonder a crowd formed as the disciples grappled with and failed to master this demon and help the boy. That was probably quite a spectacle too, right? They're trying to cast it out. The demon's probably yelling back at them. Now, the poor child is rolling around on the ground in the throes of this. Jesus asked the boy's father, how long has he been like this? From childhood, he answered. It's often thrown him into fire or water to kill him. To further cement the seriousness of the challenge at hand, Jesus speaks to the boy's father, who confirms the problem is both long-standing and life-threatening. We don't know how old this boy is, but it's been his whole life, and it's nearly killed him a number of times. Can you imagine that as a parent? Your child has a disease that if he's near a fire, it could throw him into it. He could fall into it. If he's near water, he could fall in and drown. How much more vigilance does that need? Imagine his concern for his son. Some of you here in the room today or watching online, some of you will have been there. You've dealt with a diagnosis of cancer in your child, or an accident, car accident, a fall, something serious. The rest of us pray that we never experience what that fear feels like. That this case is so serious probably added pressure to the disciples, wouldn't it? They bring this boy, you see how serious it is, and you think, if I screw this up, there's a child that's in danger here. That's added pressure. I can imagine what it's like to be a pediatric cancer doctor or nurse and to deal with that. If we don't solve this, this is a child. So the father says, but if you can do anything, take pity on us and help us. At this moment where Jesus' healing is upcoming, because we know that Jesus can and will heal the boy, right? We're not in worry about that. You know where this is going to go. Now we have a moment to step back and think, you know what? This is also about faith. This is not just about a child's healing. It's also a story about faith. So we stop and wonder what amount or what quality of faith brought this man here today seeking Jesus' help. He must have had some, right? He must have had some faith because he showed up. Was the faith that he had weakened when the disciples failed? That must have been disheartening. After he got his hopes up, he comes here only to find that Jesus is unavailable. He's not here. We're not sure when we're going to be back, but we can do it. And then they fail, which reminds him just how serious his son's condition really is. Wouldn't your faith have been shaken a little bit by a failed attempt? His belief in the goodness of God, his belief in Jesus' compassion remains because he calls for pity and mercy. But he might be asking himself, well, can Jesus do this? If his disciples failed, can even he overcome this? Maybe it really is hopeless. Maybe my son really is doomed. Imagine the emotion in this man's heart at this point. Jesus' response is profound. He says, if you can, said Jesus, everything is possible for one who believes. Now to us, the Father saying, if you can, seems kind of like a quaint question, right? Because of course Jesus can heal, but it shouldn't. If it does, we're not understanding what it was like to be in that moment. Because faith and trust and hope and all of those words that we use often interchangeably are always simpler in an academic context. They're always simpler as an intellectual exercise when you're reading about it in a book, when you're writing about it in a paper, when you're writing a sermon about it. It's always simpler in that context than it is when lives are at stake. When it's real people in the real world suffering and struggling and having pain and sorrow. Especially when we're trying to hold on to faith and hope and trust, while at the same time fear and anxiety and doubt are battering us. It's not an academic question then. So yes, we know that Jesus can heal. Do we always act like we know that? Do we at times ask God if you can? Maybe we never say that out loud because we know we shouldn't say that out loud. But do we, by our actions, actually show that that's how we feel? That we're waiting on God with an if you can attitude. Jesus says everything is possible. Now, understand this. That is not a statement of empowerment for us. That is not a I believe I can fly kind of statement, that I can do anything. That's a statement of perspective. If we believe in God, for belief and hope and faith must have something to believe in. It can't be just nebulous. It needs an object. If we believe in God, then the reality of the power of God becomes part of our point of view. The way we think of the world and life, to look at the world through a spiritual and supernatural lens where miracles are possible, precisely because they are the hand of God at work. If we have faith in God, then yes, everything is possible. It doesn't mean I can do everything, or that everything will happen the way I want it to, or just because I asked for it, but it means that I have a perspective that says, hey, God is in control. God is on his throne. God's will is not to be thwarted. That's what Jesus means when he says everything is possible for one who believes. Another aspect of Jesus' words here are a reflection on God's willingness to act on behalf of those who put their hope in him, and at the same time, as Scripture tells us, God's reluctance to act on behalf of those who disbelieve or those who doubt. Because we know that God could act independently of our belief or unbelief, right? God is not hindered or stopped just because of us. He wouldn't be God if that was true. But God chooses to utilize human faith as part of his formula. It fulfills his will. It reinforces his covenantal relationship with his people. You see, when God acts, when we demonstrate faith, it builds up our relationship with him. So God chooses to use that often enough. Now this is the heart of our text this morning. Immediately the boy's father exclaimed, I do believe. Help me overcome my unbelief. That sentence feels a little weird, doesn't it? I do, but help me overcome the fact that I don't. You see, faith is not all or nothing. It's not like a light switch where it's on, or on, off, on, off. That's not the way faith works. Not the way faith in anything or belief in anything works, let alone our faith in God. If you want to keep with the electrical analogy, a better example would be one of those lights with a dimmer switch. I don't know if you like the dimmer switches or not, but it goes up, it goes down, right? It's always on, but sometimes it's dim, sometimes it's bright. Because this man had faith. That faith brought him here. And he retains faith despite the fact that he is currently struggling to keep it strong enough for the turbulent situation at hand. Remember, his child's life is at stake. He's fighting anxiety and fear and doubt. Faith that is weakened is not lost. It can be made whole again. It can be revived. And that is an important point when either I myself am struggling with doubt or fear, so I don't lose hope, or when others are struggling, so that when I see that, I remain compassionate and seek to help them rather than sit in judgment and say, why is your faith weak? Why are you doubting? I need that perspective. You need that perspective that says faith can be revived. Just because you're struggling doesn't mean it's hopeless. Is it important to have rock-solid faith? Of course it is. But it is not reasonable and it is not realistic to expect that everyone will always possess faith that does not struggle. Some of us will see our faith tested by times of trial and loss, by pain, by death, by failure. And you know what? Some of us will see our faith tested by success and plenty and good times. Sometimes we get both of those tests. Some of us will struggle momentarily during a crisis, during a day or a short term in which it is just pushing us and we are struggling. And others of us will struggle for a season of life, for a time, for a phase when we're dealing with something that lingers for a while, like an illness. Doesn't go away overnight. But by God's grace, some of us will emerge from that deep, dark valley that David writes about in the 23rd Psalm with a faith that is stronger than what we had when we went in, because we went through it and came out the other side. In the end, this father has the correct attitude. He's humble enough to admit that his faith is weak and wise enough to ask Jesus to help him strengthen it. In our time of trial and turmoil, we need to imitate his humble response. We need to admit when we're weak and not pretend, not put on a show. And we need to seek God for assistance. So let me stop for a minute. What about my faith? What about yours? Have you had a time of doubt or anxiety or fear in the past? Is that behind you in life and you overcame it? Or is that where you are right now? Is that the moment that you're in right now, or the season that you're fighting through right now? Either way, God is merciful. He loves his children and will not let us go. He will be there for you in times of turmoil and times of tribulation. And importantly, and this is the one thing I want to emphasize this morning, so will I, and so will this church and the people here. We will not judge your pain, but we will help you carry your burden. And I say we will because we will. If we screw that up, we're going to repent and do it right the next time, but that's what we're going to do. We will walk with you until you find light and joy once more on the other side. That's what we're here for. And if we're not that, we're not the church we're supposed to be. When Jesus saw that a crowd was running to the scene, he rebuked the impure spirit. "You deaf and mute spirit," he said, "I command you, come out of him and never enter him again." Rather than make a spectacle of this situation, Jesus quickly takes action and resolves it. Notice, he didn't directly address the father's comment, did he? Jesus doesn't say anything to the father who says, "I do believe, help me overcome my unbelief." You know why? Because his actions speak for him. He doesn't need to say anything here. He simply acts. What he does will boost this man's belief. It will be all he needs, restoring him from his temporary weakening of faith by demonstrating once more that God is compassionate, that God loves him and cares for him and will help. And that is ultimately where we too must turn to see faith. If we want our faith renewed, if we want our faith built up, we need to consider the wondrous things of God. His loving kindness, his mercy to me, what he has done in my life previously, what he has done in the lives of my family and my church and my friends. When we look on what God has done in the past, not just in our lives, but in generations past, read the Psalms of David as he struggles and know that he came through the other side. When we see the hand of God in action, our faith is on the road to recovery and restoration. The spirit shrieked, convulsed him violently, and came out. The boy looked so much like a corpse that many said, "He's dead." But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him to his feet, and he stood up. Jesus was effective. His authority in this realm is not contested. When he speaks, they leave. But even at that moment of success, some who looked and saw the same thing, the boy was healed. Some looked and said, "He's dead." Life is like that, is it not? Sometimes we look at a moment and say, "Oh, it's all is lost," where everyone else is saying, "What are you talking about? We just won." They saw failure, not victory. Nevertheless, this boy was indeed alive and he was whole, thanks to Jesus. What about the disciples? Forget about them. They're the ones that failed, that started this whole thing off. What about them? After Jesus had gone indoors, his disciples asked him privately, "Why couldn't we drive it out?" So having overcome doubt from a father who justifiably had to deal with the emotion of his son's illness at the same time while he was trying to have faith, Jesus is now questioned by his own disciples. Perhaps the father's faith was new. Perhaps he didn't know that much about Jesus. That's not the disciples' situation. They're experienced. They know about Jesus. They've seen miracle after miracle. Not that this is the case, but if we were to look at faith as something like amateur and professional, rookie and veteran, the disciples are professional veterans. They've been at this for a long time. They've had success. If anybody could drive out a demon like this one, if Jesus is not there, it should be them. But they failed. They succeeded previously, but they failed this time. What's going on? We still want to know. Well, this moment's a reminder to us that faith isn't cookie cutter. It's not paint by numbers. That's not the way faith works. Spiritual warfare is not a matter of having a crucifix handy and remembering some important phrases from one of those Hollywood vampire movies as you fight them off. That's not what spiritual warfare is. Even the disciples were susceptible to failure. They could strike out. That's sobering. That's a humbling reminder. We're all still learning. We're all still dependent upon the Holy Spirit. It's not a chapter that we closed. We're still working on this. He replied, "This kind can only come out by prayer." And there's a footnote there. Some of the manuscripts say prayer and fasting. And that textual variant is intriguing. It's almost certainly a later addition, as the Bible manuscripts were copied over the century, 3rd century, 4th century, 5th century. It was almost certainly added because some of our oldest copies don't have it, because the idea of fasting became much more important in the church in the medieval period. It was not that big a deal in the first couple centuries, but by the Middle Ages, fasting was a huge part of church life. But even if it's not genuine, prayer and fasting are the same thing in this text. They're performing the same function. So whether it's just prayer or prayer and fasting, it doesn't matter, because both of those things are designed here for one purpose: to find more power. Jesus is saying that in a case like this, a regular amount of faith, I don't know what that is, but a regular amount of faith is not enough. Even Jesus' disciples, who had cast out demons before, who had performed miracles before, are going to need to gear up to get access to more spiritual power to be successful here. Well, there's a good question. How do we know if the situation that we are in needs extra faith mojo? How do we know if we've got enough or if we need more? I have absolutely no idea. I have absolutely no idea if I have enough or if you have enough for the situation you're going to face. How could I? How could you? So we've got two possibilities as we close this text this morning. Number one, we can attempt to serve God by faith, attempt to live by faith as we are right now. And if we screw up, if we fail, if we falter, if we doubt, then we go to the Lord in prayer and say, okay, I need more. So we can wait and use it when we need it. That's one way. Or might I suggest a way that I think is a little bit more efficient and useful? Assume that we need prayer and start with that before we attempt to do great things for God. Why don't we just incorporate that into our regular life anyway? In other words, treat prayer like a preemptive measure, like a vaccine. We may have spoken about that recently, like vitamins, like exercise, like the kind of thing you need before you get sick to make sure that you'll be fine when you do. Make it part of our spiritual lives. It'll make us more likely to be able to face the challenges that come our way. Let's just get after it anyway. So maybe we won't fail. Maybe our faith will hold rain or shine. But if it doesn't, God is able to build us back up again. God is able to rebuild and restore us, for faith was His gift to us in the first place. And God finishes what He starts. He will not give up on us. Three things I want you to take away from this text. Number one, faith is not academic, but organic. It can be both brought low and built up. Faith is part of our lives. It's not just on a piece of paper in a book. It's something we live with. And it grows, and it has high points and low points. We need to understand that and not treat it like a math problem. Secondly, for faith to grow, which we want, we must be humble enough to admit our deficiency and seek God for its remedy. You're not going to grow your faith if you're proud of where you're at right now and think you don't need any more. That's obvious. And then lastly, just this reminder, prayer turbocharges faith.